All right, so we are still in the prophets. We'll probably be in there for a while. To kind of just set up historically where we are. So on this, we've got from about 1000 BC, just to the end of the 10th century. We have Saul, top left. We got David, his whole period. Solomon, then of course the split. We go through, we've got Israel and Judah from Rehoboam, Jeroboam, all the way through to Jehu, who might be significant tonight, as well as Athaliah, Joash, characters I'm sure you know very, very well. And then we've got to, that was a joke because these are characters that are kind of minor. Now we're in the 8th century. You can see there's Jehu all the way to the fall of Israel at the end. And then you got Judah with Joash, Amaziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and so on. Now, we have so far talked about Jonah, although that was a while ago. And Jonah, I believe, was ministering first half or so during the reign of Jeroboam II. He was a prophet, he's mentioned in Kings, as serving Jeroboam, although that raises some rather interesting questions, right? He's in the service to Jeroboam. We know Jeroboam is an evil king who doesn't seem to tolerate prophets very well. So how does Jonah fit into that? Is he a legitimate prophet, in which case, how is he serving Jeroboam, and why is he serving Jeroboam? Or could he potentially be not a good prophet, which raises all kinds of funny scenarios as to why God has called him and why God has used him. It also explains why he's not being very obedient in the beginning. But regardless, we've got Jonah at the first half or so of Jeroboam's reign, and then we've got Amos, who seems to appear towards the second half or so of Jeroboam's reign. And so we got Amos, we've got Jonah. Jonah, as just kind of as a summary, he introduces us to the theme of judgment, divine judgment, as applied towards Assyria, the Ninevites, which in turn allows for them to respond, right? They respond in repentance, and God defers the judgment. But then we have Amos, who takes the idea of divine judgment and applies it towards Israel. Now, I did not plan for this, but it just turned out to be a happy coincidence that this last weekend we had Valentine's Day. So it seems rather appropriate that we would do a love story. So we're in Hosea tonight. I didn't plan it. It just so happened. So Hosea, of course, he's going to explore a theme that kind of comes up in Amos about why we're going to be in Hosea, why Israel deserves to be judged. So in terms of our relative timeline, you can see Jonah, kind of the first third of the 8th century. Amos and Hosea are contemporaries. We have here in the very first verse, the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and of Jeroboam II, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. So this is a rather curious assortment that we're given here, because we're told that he ministered during the reign of 4 different kings of Judah, and we get this mention of Jeroboam II. He seems to have been, his primary message is towards Israel. But we're not told of any other kings of Israel that he ministered under. And it seems like the majority of his ministry is kind of after Jeroboam's tenure. So a pretty decent summation comes from Chisholm in the BKC series. Hosea's ministry spans several decades. Most scholars accept that he probably had a ministry that went for about 30 years, beginning near the end of the reigns of Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam II, and concluding in the early years of Hezekiah. So that's a pretty substantial period of time, right? The end of Jeroboam all the way through Hezekiah. And so in his own little attestation, right, he starts sometime during Jeroboam, which could be as early as 790, although he's probably not that early, and can go well into Hezekiah, which, that's 720. That's 50 years. He didn't minister for 50 years. So it's probably much shorter than that. But most scholars, most commentaries seem to agree he's probably the bulk of his ministry is taking place after Jeroboam, which would put him, see, this is what's strange to me, because most commentaries, most series, and so on, they agree that Hosea goes before Amos, because his ministry, at least according to his listings, he would have started well into Jeroboam's reign, at least what he says. However, most commentaries agree that his main ministry takes place after Jeroboam, which would put him after Amos. Anyway, I like putting him after Amos for the various reasons that I've listed. So the bulk of his ministry, I believe, probably takes place post-Amos, which is why he's second. And something to kind of touch on as we are starting the next book. It seems to me that you have certain prophets that should or ideally be read together as sort of pairs. This applies to 8 of them. That leaves us with 4 that don't really pair well with anyone, and I don't know what to do with them in that regard. But we're not going to go too deep into this, because as we go forward, as we move, this will become more apparent, and I'll talk about how they work. But I think Joel and Malachi definitely go together. They're dealing with the end times, kind of eschatological visions, what's going to happen at the end of days type stuff. You've got Joel with his Day of the Lord prophecies, and you've got Malachi with all of the fear of the Lord prophecies. Then you have the rebuilders. So you've got the 2, and they absolutely go together. I mean, they're always listed together. You've got Haggai, Zechariah. They go back to Jerusalem with Ezra, and they help him with the rebuilding of the temple. Haggai focuses, and what's interesting is they both write about the rebuilding of the house, but they mean different things. So Haggai is talking about the house of David, whereas Zechariah is talking about the house of the Lord, the temple. And then we have what I call the tell me why prophets. So you've got Nahum, who's asking basically why was God justified in using Assyria to judge Israel. He's looking back on it. Whereas Habakkuk is looking forward to the coming judgment of Babylon against Jerusalem. And they're both asking the same question. How is God justified in doing this? And then we have the 2 main prophets who are predicting the fall of Israel, which is going to be Amos and Hosea. Now, Amos is fairly general in his approach to it. He doesn't really get too deep into any of the weeds, which I think is another reason why he's a good introduction prophet. He does talk a bit about social injustice, but that's, again, it's not as specific on that as some of the other prophets get. Whereas Hosea is going to be all in on the cultic infidelity. And the way that I like to kind of frame it is Amos gives us the what is about to happen and some fairly gruesome details, whereas Hosea is going to give us the why it is happening and some rather explicit details. So the 2 go together very, very well. So we are beginning our study on the book of Hosea. Now, what you may not realize is Hosea is not a short book. In fact, when I was starting my initial series on the minor prophets, I was talking to a couple of professors, and this came up multiple times. They said, now, as you go through the minor prophets, you're going to realize something. You're going to find a prophet that you just don't like. Like, there's 12 of them. You're bound to find one that you just don't like. In fact, I was talking to Dr. Worthington. And he's like, you'll find one that you don't like. I'm like, oh, which one do you not like? He goes, Micah. I just don't like Micah. I'm like, Micah? What's wrong with Micah? That's where the remnant is. That's where the king's coming back. You're like, I just don't like Micah. So I've gone through, and it's Hosea. Hosea is the one that I'm just not crazy about. And we'll get to why that is. But part of it is, Hosea is long. It's actually 14 chapters. Everyone, when they think of Hosea, just think of kind of the opening story about Gomer and Hosea. But it's long, and he tends to kind of get lost in the weeds. He tends to kind of ramble, and it takes a while to make the point. But we're going to plow through and get it eventually. But the book, I think, can be divided fairly nicely into 2 sections. You have the initial sort of allegorical story. I'm going to call it an allegory, and we'll get into why it's an allegory and what that means. And that is setting up the main relationship. So you got the story of Hosea and Gomer, which is going to symbolize Yahweh's contentious relationship with Israel. And then we're going to get into, from about chapter 4 to 14, we're going to get explained more theologically how all of that plays out. So we get the initial allegory that sets up the relationship and the problems with the relationship, and then the rest is parsing out theologically what that means in terms of the culture and so on. But in order to get to the second half, we have to talk about the initial story. And as we kind of wrapped up last week, I talked about how Amos kind of nicely sets up all of these minor themes, from the judgment of Judah, the fear of the Lord, remnant, and so on. And one of the things that Amos kind of teases, although doesn't really get into, is the idea of cultic infidelity. He kind of just talks about it, but doesn't really stay and moves on. And this is going to be the central theme of Hosea. I mean, the whole book is about this topic. So, of course, Amos, in chapter 3, he goes, I have known only you out of all the clans of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. He doesn't really elaborate on this, doesn't really explain, doesn't go into any details, but he does set up this language. And we don't really see, chronologically, we don't really see this language used like this. This is very, for lack of a better word, this is very sexual language. We see this in Genesis. We see this in plenty of narratives where the word no is used in the context of marriage and having children. And so this seems to have a very sexual overtone. Again, he doesn't really delve into it. He doesn't elaborate on what this means. He just moves on. That's where Hosea comes in. And Hosea is going to take this idea and he's going to run with it. So we already covered verse 1, his calling, and then the time period he's writing about. So we begin in verse 2. When the Lord first spoke to Hosea, he said this to him, go and marry a promiscuous wife or promiscuous woman. What a great way to start a book. Promiscuous wife is a very vague phrase, and scholars, commentaries, and so on are not in agreement about what this means. There's all kinds of theories. The standard kind of go-to definition that people just kind of jump at is that he's just going and marrying some kind of prostitute. Like, go and find some streetwalker and propose to her and take her home. That's not what everyone agrees. There's plenty of other theories. Some say that she's not just a run-of-the-mill streetwalker, she's actually a temple prostitute. That raises other questions. For one thing, Israel's not supposed to have temple prostitutes. That's clearly outlawed in Torah, but we know that Israel's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, so maybe they have them. She could just be a well-known promiscuous woman. She's not doing it for money. She's just a known hussy. What? Good word. She's just a very known, publicly known loose woman. The other option is that this is a virgin, a woman who is not a hussy or a prostitute of any sort, but that this is a woman that God has told Hosea, you need to go marry, but God's just telling him up front, she's not going to be faithful to you. And you just have to accept that she's not going to be faithful to you. And you have to marry her knowing she's not going to be faithful to you. So commentaries are surprisingly pretty divided on which option we're going with. And there's significance to each one, right? Is she an open prostitute? Is she a cult temple prostitute? I mean, there's all kinds of meaning behind both of those. Is she just an openly known loose woman? Or is this a virgin that Hosea is being set up with, right? That you just got to know she's not going to be faithful to you. We're not going to get too deep into this point, but we just don't know, right? Because the language is very unclear. She's just a promiscuous woman. We don't know. But go and marry this woman, presumably someone that God has picked for Hosea, and have children of promiscuity. So children out of this contentious relationship. For the land is committing blatant acts of promiscuity by abandoning the Lord. And so this raises an interesting scenario, although it shouldn't be. This story, because if you're just going through the prophets, this story kind of lashes, because this story comes out and strikes us as very odd. Like, why is God putting Hosea through this? And the answer is, he's not putting just Hosea through this. He's put plenty of other prophets in similar situations, although not this specific one. When we think of prophets, we often, I don't know what you think of, but prophets have a multiple variety of roles. The main thing tends to be that they just go around preaching, right? God gives them a message, and then they go and they preach, either to the kings or to the priests or to the people or whatever. Prophets can receive visions, and that's beyond just Joseph and Daniel. We tend to think of them, but plenty of other prophets have received visions, whether it's Zechariah or even Amos or Ezekiel, Isaiah. Plenty of prophets have visions. But another element to the prophetic ministry is performance, that you actually act out the message. And you may go, well, how many do that? I mean, a lot do that. So you've got Ahijah of Shiloh, you've got Elijah, Elisha, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah. Plenty of prophets are given some sort of instruction, and then they have to perform the act of the prophecy. In fact, probably the most famous of this group of performers is going to be Hosea. We just know the Gomer story so well. But Isaiah, the most famous Isaiah one is that he's told to walk around Jerusalem naked because Jerusalem, the inhabitants, are going to be taken out of Jerusalem by captivity, and they're going to be dragged out naked. Ezekiel has plenty of performative prophecies, whether he's playing with his little tin soldiers in the dirt, or he's baking unclean bread, or he's not allowed to mourn for his wife after she dies. Very similar to Hosea, right, is, I think, Ezekiel not being allowed to mourn his wife's death. Also, Jeremiah is told he's not allowed to marry because, as an outward sign of lament and sadness and so on. So plenty of other prophets have been given similar types of prophetic performances that they have to do. Now, it's such an ingrained concept for us that we probably don't even think about it, but really it's Hosea that really sets up this idea of Yahweh married to Israel. We just don't see that language very much before this. And the playing of the covenant idea, that the covenant Israel shares with Yahweh is a marriage-type relationship. Now, Ezekiel, most famously, he runs with it. He even runs further than Hosea does. But yeah, we just don't really see that imagery and that language prior to Hosea. It's just not really there. So in verse 3, he went and married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will bring the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu. Oh boy, there's a lot in these two verses. So, and you're expected to know a lot to understand what's going on in these two verses. What happened in Jezreel? Any guesses? Actually, a lot of things happened in Jezreel. Jezreel is a fairly famous valley. In my head, there's a cop movie, and they're set up. These partners are told to go to this really shady hotel, and that they're supposed to meet an informant or whatever. And they get there and they're set up. And one of the cops say to the other, like, why did they bring us here? And the other cop goes, a lot of bad stuff has happened in this hotel. And so I'm just thinking, like, the Valley of Jezreel, like, what happened? What hasn't happened in the Valley of Jezreel? A lot of bad things have happened in the Valley of Jezreel. But we're told that he's being named Jezreel for a little while. He's going to bring the bloodshed of Jezreel on Jehu. So to really understand, we have to go through a fair amount of history. So Jezreel is where a man named Naboth had a vineyard. And it was a very nice vineyard, apparently. So Ahab, the evil king, decided he was going to take the vineyard. He had killed Naboth over it, and this brought about the anger of Yahweh. I mean, was this really the most evil thing Ahab did? I mean, he did a lot of evil things, but for some reason, this is just really known in the Bible. So Elijah shows up and condemns Ahab over it. He does other stuff as well, but you have this vineyard in the Valley of Jezreel. And so part of the judgment by Elijah is that Ahab will be killed in Jezreel over this vineyard, and that Jezebel will also die in Jezreel, which is a really funny prophecy, and we'll get to why that's funny. So, this is in 1 Kings 19. The Lord said to Elijah, go and return by the way you came to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you are to anoint Hazael as king over Aram. You are to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Maholah, as prophet in your place. Then Jehu will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Jehu. So, He's got 3 people who are all going to work together in various capacities to bring judgment against Ahab and Jezebel. In particular, the one we care about is Jehu. And Jehu is a Chad among Chads. He is boss. He's a great guy. We love Jehu, at least initially. He is going to take over as king of Israel. So we jump to 2 Kings 9. When Jehu came to Jezreel, so Hazael wages war against Israel. Israel loses. Ahab dies in the war. Jezebel heard about it, and she painted her eyes, adorned her head, looked down from the window as Jehu entered the gate. She said, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, killer of your master?" So Jehu is coming back after the battle that Hazael won, and he's come to take over Israel, but also kill Jezebel. Jezebel knows this. So verse 32, he looked up toward the window and said, "Who is on my side?" Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him, and he said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and Jehu rode over her. So they throw her out the window, she falls, and she dies. They put her on a cart. Now you may go, well, but she didn't die in Jezreel. The prophecy was that she would die in Jezreel. Well, they put her on a cart, and they take the cart to Jezreel, and then she's eaten by dogs in Jezreel. So, fairly gruesome story. Then, after he becomes king, this is one of the best stories in the Old Testament. He decides that he is going to hold a sacrifice for Baal. So he wants this massive ceremony where he's going to have this enormous sacrifice. And he invites all the priests of Baal to come and take part in this massive sacrifice. So he's got thousands of priests, or however many there are. And he's like, "Are all the priests here?" And they're like, "Yes, we're all here." So as they're going about offering the sacrifices, he has his soldiers go and kill all the priests. So he basically purges Israel of the Baal priests. And it seems like he is a really good king. Like, this is the king that Israel's been waiting for a really long time. So Jehu, we got our little genealogy here. You got Jeroboam the first. He's up there in the gold. It brings us all the way down to Omri. He starts the house of Omri. That's Ahab and Jezebel. And then it is Jehu, he's in the red, who brings judgment against Ahab. And it seems like Jehu is the king. He's the one who's going to restore Israel. He's the one who's going to purge Israel. He's the king Israel's been waiting for. Where have we heard that before? So, just to remind you, so we now have the history of Jezreel, right? Name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will bring the bloodshed of Jezreel. So the bloodshed of Jezreel is the judgment of Ahab, right? When Ahab's house was purged and Israel was purged. Like, that's a good thing, right? That was a good thing when Israel was purged of the evil of Ahab. But he is going to bring the same purge on the house of Jehu. I thought Jehu was the good guy. I thought Jehu was the one who purged Jezreel. Well, this is why we need to know the rest of the story. Jehu eliminated Baal worship from Israel, but he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and caused Israel to commit worshiping the golden calves that were in Bethel and Dan. So, he got rid of the Baal priests and the Baal worship, but he didn't get rid of all the other stuff. He continued to let other pagan worship happening. And so, what seemed like a really good start just didn't really go anywhere. Nevertheless, the Lord said to Jehu, "Because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, for 4 generations of your sons will sit on the throne of Israel." Yet Jehu was not careful to follow the instruction of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins that Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. So this is just one of many examples of a king who starts really, really well and ends very, very badly. Just to kind of bring this back to Amos, because Amos had a similar little prophecy back in chapter 7. He said, Jacob's high places will be deserted, and Israel's sanctuaries will be in ruins. I will rise up against the house of Jeroboam with a sword. So, and I mentioned then, right, that if he had wanted to be specific, he could have said, the house of Jehu, because that is the royal house, and that's what we would expect him to say. But when he says Jeroboam, he means all of Israel, right, the entire thing, the entire government. But here, Hosea is being specific, right? He's letting us know who's really getting judged. So I will bring bloodshed on the house of Jezreel, on the house of Jehu, and put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So he zooms in on Jehu, right, like a telescope, right? We're zooming in on Jehu, but then he kind of goes back a bit and goes, all of Israel, right? The entire house, the entire kingdom of Israel is getting judged, kind of like what Amos has just said. On that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Verse 6. She conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to him, lay her lo ruhamah, which means no compassion, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. I will certainly take them away, but I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and I will deliver them by the Lord their God. I will not deliver them by bow, sword, or war, or by horses and cavalry. After Gomer had weaned no compassion, she conceived and gave birth to a son. Then the Lord said, name him Lo-Ami, not my people, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God. So this is Hosea. So again, we're going chronologically. He is before Isaiah, so in terms of our history. And Isaiah will also do something similar, where he will have, Shir Yashab and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. So we will see other prophets have children and then give them very symbolic names. So like in chapter 8, then the Lord said to me, take a large piece of parchment and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, quick to plunder, swift to spoil. I've appointed trustworthy witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah, son of Jeberechiah. So we'll see this kind of thing by other prophets, the idea of having children and then giving them very symbolic names. So Gomer has 3 kids, supposedly, with Hosea. You got Jezreel, which symbolizes the judgment that is coming on the house of Jehu. You've got Lo Ruhamah, because God will not have compassion on Israel. And then you have Lo-Ami, because God is no longer going to recognize them as his people. So after Gomer had weaned no compassion, she conceived and gave birth to a son, then said, you are not my people. This sounds an awful lot like So he says, you are not my people. And this language seems to be the inversion of what we see in earlier promises. So like we go to Leviticus 26. I will walk among you and be your God, and you'll be my people. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so that you would no longer be their slaves. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to live in freedom, which in turn is an elaboration of the Abrahamic covenant, right? His promises to Abram. So your name will no longer be Abram, but your name will be Abraham, for I will make you a father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and will make nations and kings come from you. I will keep my covenant between me and you and your future offspring throughout your generations as an everlasting covenant, to be your God and the God of your offspring after you. And to you and your future offspring I will give the land where you are residing, all the land of Canaan, as an eternal possession, and I will be their God. So this seems to be a bit in conflict, right? He's having this child whose name is Lo-Ami, not my people, because God is saying, I no longer recognize Israel as my people, which, again, seems to be in conflict with what we got from Leviticus and the Abrahamic covenant, which Hosea is aware of. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he's saying. Because in the very next verse, verse 10, yet the number of the Israelites will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted, and in the place where they were told, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. So he has just made this pronouncement that they will no longer be God's people, and yet this is right out of the Abrahamic covenant. Right? The very next verse, he's quoting the Abrahamic covenant, which seems to suggest that God has made a promise to his people that they will be blessed and multiply and so on. So now we've got a bit of a conflict, right? God is not recognizing them, and yet he's made a promise to them that he's not supposed to break. So then we get a rather infamous verse. And the Judeans and the Israelites will be gathered together. They will appoint for themselves a single ruler and go up from the land, for the day of Jezreel will be great. Call your brothers my people and your sisters compassion. Oh, we're not there yet. Okay, so now we have the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. This is a really interesting verse because, as far as I can tell, chronologically, this is the first time that we get a promise that Israel and Judah will be reunited. because up to this point, they've been separated since after the time of Solomon. So he's making this promise, right? After he's already said that he's no longer going to recognize Israel, he's saying that Israel and Judah will come back together, and they will be united under this ruler, whoever the ruler is going to be. We can go all the way back to Deuteronomy that talks about the promise that he is going to bless them, take them into the land, give them the land, but if they're unfaithful, if they are not good stewards of the land, eventually the land will vomit them out, will get rid of them, right? But he also allows in Deuteronomy that when you are in exile, if you are faithful, eventually you will be returned to the land. So that is already in Deuteronomy, right? The provision that you'll have the land, but if you don't follow my commandments, I can remove you, but I promise to bring you back. That's in Deuteronomy. Amos has already introduced us to the idea that he is going to restore the house of David. So our very first writing prophet. That's already in the consciousness. But what's new now is Hosea's promise that the two nations will come back together. So we're still pretty early in the prophets, but this is a really interesting idea. It reminds me, because I just think the comparison's really funny. In Egyptian literature, Egyptian history is framed as a period of kingdoms where Egypt, north and south, is united, and then usually there's a civil war that splits the kingdom, and then it's united again, it splits, it's united, and so on. And we actually have a prophecy, which sounds like it comes right out of the Old Testament. It doesn't, but this is the prophecy of Neferti. Then a king will come from the south, Ameni the justified by name, son of a woman of Taseti, child of Upper Egypt. He will take the white crown, he will wear the red crown, he will join the crowns together. I mean, this sounds like it could be from the Old Testament, right? It could be one of the prophets. A king from the south, from Judah, will rise up and he'll wear the two crowns and reunite the country. And Asiatics will fall to his sword, Libyans will fall to his flame, rebels to his wrath, traitors to his might. As the serpent on his brow subdues the rebels for him, one will build the walls of the ruler to bar Asiatics from entering Egypt. Now, what's funny about this prophecy is that it was written with Amenemhat I in mind. The thing is, he's not the one that reunited the two countries. It was actually this guy, Nehepetra II. I think it's really funny. But here we have, again, a rather unique and kind of an original promise coming out of Hosea that despite what's going to happen, right, that God seemingly has set aside Israel, he promises he's going to reunite Israel with Judah under a new king. This seems to be also a very early indication of, you've got the promise of a sort of new country, right? A new kingdom that will emerge, but also the prophecy of a new king. So we're combining different ideas, right? The prophets are toying with a lot of new areas of prophecy. So it's not just a king that's going to come. Amos has already toyed with that, the promise of the renewal of David's house, but the idea of reuniting God's people, right? And also presumably bringing them out of exile because they're about to go into exile. So a lot of things are converging now. So verse 2, rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove the promiscuous look from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Otherwise, I will strip her naked and expose her as she was on the day of her birth. I will make her like a desert and like a parched land, and I will let her die of thirst. So this raises a rather uncomfortable question. And I was looking at one commentary who said that the immediate thought is that this sounds like divorce language, right? We've already set up that they're no longer my people, and now he says, I am no longer your husband. But we know, particularly from Malachi, although he's going to be our last prophet, that God hates divorce. The problem is that Isaiah actually says in chapter 50, this is what the Lord says, where is your mother's divorce certificate? And he's talking about Israel. Jeremiah also says this. I observed that it was because unfaithful Israel had committed adultery that I had sent her away and given her a certificate of divorce. So all of this comes from Hosea. The idea that God is sending her away and has given her this divorce certificate. The question is, what does this mean? And how do we take this in light of everything else that's going on? So in verse 4, I will have no compassion on her children because they are the children of promiscuity. Yes, their mother is promiscuous. She conceived them and acted shamefully, for she thought, I will go after my lovers, the men who gave me my food and water, my wool and flax, my oil and drink. Again, Ezekiel really carries this idea much further than Hosea does. But the idea seems to be, because again, we're not talking about Gomer in this situation. We're talking about Israel. And the parallel between what Israel is doing and what Gomer has done or will do, or however that works in the terms of time. But Israel has been unfaithful. And so God, within the context of this allegory, has effectively given her what she thinks she wants, leave to go and pursue what she wants. Now, we'll get to the significance of that because I think we do get a setup for this. But in verse 6, therefore this is what I will do. I will block her way with thorns. I will enclose her with a wall so that she cannot find her paths. She will pursue her lovers but not catch them. She will seek them but not find them. So she's going to pursue. She's going to go after these other lovers, presumably other gods, right? But she's not going to enter into a relationship with them. She's not going to marry any of them or go into a covenant with them. She can't. They're not real gods. This is significant because of the divorce law in Deuteronomy. If a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him because he finds something improper about her, he may write her a certificate of divorce, hand it to her, and send her away from his house. If after leaving his house she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the second man hates her, writes her certificate of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house, or if he dies, the first husband who sent her away may not marry her again after she had been defiled, because that would be detestable to the Lord. You must not bring guilt on the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So, you're married, it doesn't work out, the husband authorizes the divorce, you then go and marry someone else. The first husband can't remarry. So Israel has been unfaithful. She is unhappy with Yahweh. And so Yahweh has given her approval within the situation of this story to go and pursue her other lovers. It's not going to go anywhere because they don't want her, and it's not going to materialize in a new marriage. If it did, that would be a problem because Yahweh, according to Deuteronomy, couldn't remarry her. But I think we will get a resolution to this. She will pursue her lovers but not catch them. She will seek them but not find them. Then she will think, I will go back to my former husband, for then it was better for me than now. So she'll pursue these people, these other lovers, which are the gods, right, thinking that the gods will take care of her and realize they're not going to take care of her. They don't want her. They don't want to marry her. And so once she is now in a situation where she realizes, these other gods aren't going to provide for her, she will realize that she was better off with Yahweh and return to Yahweh. Verse 8, she does not recognize that it is I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil. I lavished silver and gold on her, which they used for Baal. Therefore, I will take back my grain in its time, and my new wine in its season. I will take away my wool and linen, which were to cover her nakedness. So as part of this separation period, he's not going to let her leave with all of the stuff he gave her. He's going to make her fend for herself and realize that it was all from Yahweh in the first place. And then she's going to go and beg her other gods, her other lovers to take care of her, and they're not going to do that. They don't want her. They don't want to take care of her. Verse 10, now I'll expose her shame in the sight of her lovers, and no one will rescue her from my hands. I will put an end to all her celebrations, her feasts, new moons, and Sabbaths, all her festivals. This particularly is where people get a little uncomfortable, mainly because this whole scenario is much more made explicit and elaborated on in Ezekiel 16. So the idea that God is not only punishing Israel, but also shaming her. I take the story here as somewhat allegorical, that the relationship is symbolic, but the punishment is going to be very real, right? Israel is going to be punished by Assyria, and is going to be humiliated in the sense of taking into captivity, right? She is removed from the land and will have to endure a period of time apart from Yahweh. So this is all just kind of this is all a story that is symbolizing what Israel's about to experience. Verse 12, I will devastate her vines and fig trees. She thinks that these are her wages that her lovers have given her. I will turn them into a thicket, and the wild animals will eat them, and I will punish her for the days of the Baals, when she burned incense to them, put on her rings and jewelry, and went after her lovers, but forgot me. This is the Lord's declaration. So she acts, right, that all the blessings she has, the land, the whatever, the figs, the vines, that these are coming from the other gods, which they're not. So Yahweh is going to remove them from her and make her realize that the other gods can't give them back to her, that the other gods can't provide for her, care for her, and so on. And this is all to reveal to Israel, to the Israelites, that it wasn't these other gods that took care of her, as she has been presuming. In verse 14, therefore I am going to persuade her, lead her to the wilderness, and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her vineyards back to her and make the valley of Achor into a gateway of hope. There she will respond as she did in the days of her youth, as in the day she came out of the land of Egypt. So by taking all the stuff away and by making her realize that these other gods that she's pursued can't take care of her and don't want her, is basically going to put her in a situation where she realizes not only how desperate she is compared, in relation to the other gods, but that she did have it better with Yahweh and that she wants to be with Yahweh. So we've got this, I will give her vineyards back to her and make the valley of Achor into a gateway of hope. I think that, Amos is setting up something where he is taking different elements and combining them. And this is part of the reason why I'm not as happy with Hosea as I am with, say, Ezekiel, because I think Ezekiel does this better. I think he does it in a very, very clever way. But Amos has already teased this idea, right? After Israel has been judged and taken into the exile, he says, right, in chapter 9, I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild and occupy ruined cities, plant vineyards, and drink their wine. He has already said that whatever you do, right, you're planting your vineyards, but you won't enjoy them. You're building mansions or tombs or whatever, these house of marbles, but you're not going to enjoy them because they're going to be taken from you by the Assyrians and you go into exile. But then in chapter 9, he says, when you come back, you'll be back in the land, you'll plant your vineyards, and you'll enjoy them. And this language we see over and over again in the prophets, the idea of going back to the land and enjoying the land, enjoying the vineyards, and so on. So we've already got this idea of going back and enjoying your vineyard. But we also had the reference to Jezreel, which we should know from our Israelite history is infamous because of the Naboth vineyard. So the judgment of Jezreel is tied to the stealing of the Naboth vineyard. So I think he's combining these two things. That, because with the story of Jezreel, it was about someone losing his vineyard. And God is saying, I am going to take you back in the land, I'm going to restore everything, I'm going to undo all of this. So I think that he's kind of bringing us back to that idea of the judgment of Jezreel and the restoration of property and the restoration of the vineyard. So in verse 16, in that day, this is the Lord's declaration, you will call me my husband, and you will no longer call me my Lord, for I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth. They will no longer be remembered by their names. This seems to be almost a joke, which they do exist in the Bible, like prophets and so on, they can crack jokes. The word Baal in Hebrew just means Lord or master. And so that, of course, that term is used and applied to the god Baal. And very infamously, I know, this is no one's favorite verse, 1 Peter, for in the past, the holy women who put their hope in God also beautified themselves in this way, submitting to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. It's in the Bible. I don't know what to tell you. This, of course, goes back from Genesis 18. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing, so she laughed to herself After I have become shriveled up and my Lord is old, will I have delight? So yes, Sarah refers to Abraham as Lord, as opposed to just the more generic husband. And Hosea seems to be making a joke, right? That the paganism, the idolatry will become so detestable that people aren't even going to use the word Baal anymore, even in a generic sense, because the word Baal can just mean master. So you won't even use that word because it has such a detestable connotation. Verse 18, on that day I will make a covenant for them. With the wild animals, the birds of the sky, and the creatures that crawl on the ground, I will shatter bow, sword, and weapons of war in the land, and will enable the people to rest securely. I will take you to be my wife forever. I will take you to be my wife in righteousness, justice, love, and compassion. So after all of this has happened, right? Now, the language is kind of vague. He is going to establish a new covenant with them. Now, this raises the question, what do we mean by new? Because in Hebrew and in Greek, there's really no way to distinguish two different ideas, because we use the word new in two different ways, and we tend to have words to explain what we mean. Do we mean new in the sense of original, something that's never existed before? Or do we mean new in the sense of retro, something that has been renewed? So when he says, I will make a covenant for them, is he talking about a brand new covenant, something that has not existed before, or is he talking about a renewal of the covenant? Such as, because we're talking in the language of marriage, is he talking about renewing his vows, basically? So he's given her the certificate of divorce, letting her kind of go off, but she's not going to remarry because he's not going to let her, basically. And so because she doesn't remarry, he could take her back, and they can renew their vows. Is that what he's talking about? So, if it's renewal, we've had plenty of covenants. We have if you want to call it the Adamic covenant, we've got the Noahic covenant, we've got the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic, the Davidic. And then we have, of course, the Jeremiah covenant, which is the new covenant that we tend to associate with Christ. So he says, I will take you to be my wife in faithfulness, and you will know Yahweh on that day. I will respond. This is the Lord's declaration. I will respond to the sky, and it will respond to the earth. This conclusion and this kind of language is almost exactly what we have at the end of Ezekiel 16. I will establish my covenant with you. This is after he has put Israel, Judah through all of this. Very similar story, very similar situation. And this is the end. My covenant with you, and you will know that I am Yahweh, so that when I make atonement for all you have done, you will remember and be ashamed and never open your mouth again because of your disgrace. This is the declaration of the Lord God. So Ezekiel seems to be playing with the exact same idea and the exact same language. The question again is, are we talking about a whole new covenant, a new vow that they're making, or again, is this a renewal of the vow? And then if it's a renewal of the vow, which vow are they renewing? Are they renewing the Abrahamic covenant, which is possible? Are they renewing the Davidic covenant, which is possible? It's probably one of those two. I don't think they're renewing the Mosaic covenant. It's probably the Abrahamic or the Davidic, which both would work, but it's also possible that we're talking about a whole new covenant, like the Jeremiah covenant that's being proposed. So we don't know, because he doesn't tell us which covenant. Verse 22, the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. There's that language again, right? So even Jezreel is going to be sort of restored. I will sow her in the land for myself, and I will have compassion on no compassion. I will say to not my people, you are my people, and he will say, you are my God. So even though he had that very harsh language, it seemed like he was throwing away the children, he didn't acknowledge them, and so on. After all of this is done, after the new covenant, whatever that is restored, he is going to acknowledge these children, and it's all going to be right in the end. Chapter 3. Then the Lord said to me, go again, show love to a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. So at this point in the story, analogy, allegory, how we understand it, apparently Gomer's not around. She has left him. And not only has she left him, but she seems to be in the possession of another man, most likely her pimp. So she has gone and is now working as like a harlot or something. And in order to demonstrate what God is going to do and to demonstrate God's love for Israel, Hosea has to go and buy his wife back from this pimp-like character. So verse 2, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and 5 bushels of barley. I said to her, you must live with me many days. Don't be promiscuous or belong to any man, and I will act the same way toward you. This, again, is presumably after they've been married, after they've had the kids, and she has now gone, left him, and has done things that we probably don't want to think about. Verse 4, for the Israelites must live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, and without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. So after all of this has been said, right, after all they've gone through, he's going to bring them back to the land. He's going to restore the covenant with them. He's going to restore the kingship, because we've already had that reference, right? Amos has told us the house of David will be rebuilt. And Hosea has now told us that Israel is going to be reunited with Judah under this new king. And then it's all going to, again, be right in the end when all this is settled. So we will end on that note.
All righty. Well, thank you, brother. Appreciate that. A lot of history there. A lot of mercy from the Lord for all of us. Amen. John, would you close us tonight?